First of all, to make some announcements that except the person staged for photography, no other will make any photograph or video. So please note it. Our today's topic is peace building operations. And when we realized the United Nations peace building operations, the first one we had was in 1948 with the birth of United Nations. The first peace building operation was that of 50 members of United Nations Guard forces to assist the mediation in supervising the truce in Palestine at that time between the Israelis and the people of Palestine, known as UNTSO, United Nations Truce Supervision at that time. And over the period of time, then the peace building operation in different parts of the world, the United Nations kept on increasing its numbers. And we have seen some progress, some achievements in these peace building operations, especially in different areas. But at the same time, we saw that United Nations actually failed to stop some genocide, some crimes against humanity, and there was no stoppage of the conflicts around the globe. Those were the failures on the part of United Nations. Is that the Security Council, which assumes the greater responsibility to have to maintain peace and stability and to decide the matters on the basis of justice and peace and equality. Unfortunately, this Security Council became more a political organization than that of a decision making on the basis of peace. So the big powers, the big five, used the veto in different situations at many times, as former used it 55 times before the disintegration of USSR with Russia again. Similarly, United States has used so far it 91 times this veto only to save the Israeli interests in the Middle East. So these some of the things, and along with that, United Nations Security Council also failed to implement its resolutions, which they passed for the right self-determination of people of Palestine, Kashmir, Western Sahara, and many other places. And we saw during the period of time, many states came into being. When United Nations came into existence, we had only 52 or 54 states. Now we have 192 states. Most of the states came in from different ways. Some used the right to self-determination, to have these, and in some there was some division in the states, and many things happened. And we saw that in the same way, then it was thought during, I think, 2000 or in 90s that there should be a mechanism to protect the genocide, to protect the mass human rights violation, or to protect the conflicts, and that for that purpose, the responsibility to protect R2P was established in the World Conference for Human World Conference, and it was adopted that this will do the stop to halt the mass crimes, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity at different places. But unfortunately, we saw again, this was because when the world failed to stop the genocide in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and other places, then this instrument came in that there should be R2P. But we could see that everything has been passed so far is used selectively by the big powers, and many things, many of the power is used outside the parameters of the United Nations. When the NATO came in and other things came and they used their own parameters to deal with the conflicts around the globe. That's why we are this time witnessing number of conflicts. Russia invading Ukraine. This crisis has put whole of the world on the brink of almost on the Third World War situation, and similarly the Israeli incursion in Gaza, the mass atrocities in Gaza. This is another thing which is threatening the international peace and security. And in our continent, we see the Kashmir situation, which is a nuclear flashpoint between India and Pakistan, because the people of Kashmir have been living under the Indian occupation for the last 77 years, and for the right celebration that and all those powers of the India, those were the powers who negotiated the agreements, who negotiated the United Nations Security Council resolutions for Kashmir, for the people's right to self-determination. I mean, United States, I mean, UK and others who are this time allies of the India. At that time, it was USSR, or who would abstain at that time from the war. The international system has changed on their interests because of their interests, and they don't take any engage themselves in their strategic interests, their economic interests, not value the human rights and the principles adopted in the United Nations. These things which evolved over the period of time. So we have a good panel today to discuss all these. We have with us Mr. Robert Fajana. He's an expert in conflict resolution, extensively on Palestine, on Kashmir, and different things. A writer. We have Mr. Professor Joseph Ranka. Joseph Ranka is no introduction as a well-known human rights defender and as a professor of international law. And with me is also a young scholar, Ms. Basi. I don't think she has joined us or not. We have Mrs. Zafar Qureshi, is a son of soil from Kashmir, and last but not the least, Leon Siu, our great fight is with us here. To start with, I think I should go straight away to Professor Joseph Ronka, and us from United States. Professor, you have the floor, and you have 12 minutes.
How many minutes? 10?
12.
So I'll hurry up. Thank you very much for the invite. When Alti, if you had invited me, and I've known you since, I don't know, I think 2008, when I was representing the International Association of Schools who works at the UN. And it's good to see you again. And when you asked me to talk about the failure of the United Nations and ultimately what's about the hypocrisy of government and big powers, I gladly said yes. Now, in my view, the United Nations has failed to stop, let alone prevented, some of the most horrific wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, and let me add the war in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which, as Pope Francis said, nobody cares about. In fact, just this morning in the Times, they had a big article on the Western neglect of what's going on in Ethiopia and rape as a violence of war. These wars are in addition to the UN's failure to resolve such ongoing conflicts, such as in Kashmir, as you mentioned, and most recently, I would say the gang wars in Haiti, who is a member of the UN. There are also other problems that the United Nations has failed to resolve that have been exacerbated over doubled since the advent of COVID-19, and the incomes of roughly 90% of humanity have fallen since COVID began. According to Oxfam, every 26 hours, a new billionaire is minted. Indeed, the governments of this world, under the auspices of the United Nations, have committed themselves to the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the authoritative definition of human rights standards and its long train of declarations and conventions, to quote former human rights Pope, now Saint John Paul II, such as declarations to eradicate extreme poverty, conventions to eradicate such social and individual malaise like classism, calling for economic and social justice worldwide, the equal distribution of wealth, as well as the eradication of such things like racism, sexism, disableism, and xenophobia, and special rapporteurs such as the special rapporteurs. So given government the United Nations initiatives, can we not say that this august body of United Nations that has given birth to such documents amounts to nothing but fluff, hot air that might make governments look good to their constituents? After all, nobody would say they're against human rights these days, so governments sign these lofty sounding documents. Do they amount to nothing? Thus, can we not say that the United Nations is a failure? But, but in those rather ineffective, I think words of Senator Fulbright, who initiated a rather effective, if not prestigious, program of scholars and activists to engage in international educational and exchange programs with other countries. You might have heard of the Fulbright Exchange Program of the United States. He said, criticism of one's country and of the United Nations is an implied tribute. So I'm criticizing, but it's an implied tribute. I feel that the United Nations has done some pretty good stuff over the years, some of which I would like to mention now, proffering simply what the UN could do better moving ahead. Before continuing, I would like to say what is also obvious. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, prior to that, Europe would literally, I think, blow themselves up every 20 years or so. They were vicious. The Third World War has not erupted since the founding of the United Nations. Well, almost, but anyway, just something to think about. Let me talk about some successes. I feel that there is now a global thrust for human rights education. And let's recall that human rights was coined by the United Nations in 1945, and people are integrating human rights education from the grammar, high school, college, graduate, and professional levels. At least in the United States, schools that have implemented human rights education, they have found that it stopped bullying. You know, bullying, it's a big problem throughout the world. There was one situation of a girl in Western Massachusetts where I live who just came from Europe, was Ireland. She was dressed very conservatively and according with their culture, and she was consistently bullied. She was old-fashioned. She was a prude. She was called names. She killed herself. Reportedly, that school initiated human rights education and bullying has lessened considerably. Not another suicide was reported. I think it does something to children to learn about treating others with human dignity and in non-prejudicial ways, which are substantive, crucial notions that can be found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are other numerous human rights trainings. I'm thinking, for example, the United Nations document on the human rights training for law enforcement personnel, which teaches the importance of character transformation of law enforcement personnel like police to treat all those with human dignity and those suspected of crimes. I, who lives in the land of George Floyd, you might have heard of him. He was murdered by a policeman. would do the officials would do well to incorporate that training manual into their training of police officers. Let me also say that human rights documents have done a lot to change what can be called symbolic consciousness. In other words, and very briefly, cultures tend to see people as the architects of their own fate. They are poor or homeless. They live in extreme poverty because they are lazy. They don't want to work. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserts, among other things, in Article 28, that we need a social and international order in which rights to work, eat nutritious food, have shelter, and rights are interdependent can be realized. We have come to see those who live in extreme poverty not as nefarious, lazy individuals, but as victims of such things as savage capitalism, the failure of governments to provide socially useful work that contributes to the development of the human personality, the failure of governments to provide progressive taxation. Human rights education has made us more sympathetic and compassionate to their plight. Compassion being an ethic that is found in almost all of the world's religion, according to the Dalai Lama. Let me talk about some other notable contributions of the UN and some comments as to what they could do better. One is the promotion of development through the Millennium Development Goals. Well, now they're called the Sustainable Development Goals, which has enunciated beautiful targets, funded roughly 13,000 development projects. Okay, a little criticism here, but it's an implied tribute. Many of those projects, however, were funded by the World Bank, which Philip Alston, Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, said the World Bank was a human rights-free zone because they tend to um, work on projects like roads, digging of oil wells and ports that seem to have taken the place of projects that would more directly help the poor, such as hospital education, being of democracy. The United Nations has provided monitors through numerous countries on voting throughout the world. While it is important, members of legislative bodies, at least I know in the United States, tend to be white men and billionaires, if not multimillionaires, who generally are insensitive to the plights of the poor, let alone issues pertaining to women. 25% of those in Congress are women. While it is good to implement voting rights, the pool needs to be expanded such that we don't work just for millionaires or white men, but other groups. The UN has also helped to promote self-determination and independence from colonial powers. Before the United Nations, roughly 1/3 of the world was under colonial domination. That's 60 countries. Now it's roughly 17. And has also helped to promote women's rights, children's rights of people with disabilities, rights of indigenous peoples. While my country, the United States, has ratified major UN documents on women, children, and disability rights, and we were the last country to endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Nevertheless, these documents have provided tremendous guiding principles to promote such rights as the right to play for children and nutritious food for children, the right to special protections for pregnant women before and after childbirth, special accommodations to people with this, and the right to self-determination, including a spiritual connection with the lands, fauna, and water for indigenous peoples. But somehow the United Nations in tandem with governments must do more to implement these conventions than simply through special rapporteurs, reports to monitoring committees. They are important, certainly, but we must find other ways to do that. If I can drop a name or two, a while back, I actually with Noam Chomsky, who I knew will know, or asked the government to have a department of human rights cabinets. Human rights cabinet that would coordinate UN and domestic policy. Nothing came of it. Let me just say, and then I'll finish in about 3 minutes. Thank you for your time. I don't want to go over. If we had more time, we would discuss how the UN has failed or succeeded years. And let us just say that this is about peace. And a beautiful book. He is a specialist on violence. He basically said, when human needs are frustrated, violence ensues. So everything I said before, we're basically talking about human development. And you know what's going on in the Palestinian territories? I don't know. I believe it's like 70% unemployment before October 7th. For the sake of time, before concluding, a few words about the hypocrisy of governments and big powers. Generally, I think governments have a kind of a la carte approach to human rights principles. Take my government. I would say I'm very lucky in many ways because we're very strong on civil and political rights like freedom of speech, the press, and peaceful assembly. I'm fortunate. I've been criticizing my country for ages. I don't disappear in the middle of the night, but there are other rights, like the rights to healthcare, shelter, the right to life and peace, which are independent. Roughly 20,000 people died last year by guns. The United States produces roughly 55% of the world's armaments. I ask my country to heed the words of our former President Dwight Eisenhower, who said, "Every bomb made is theft from the poor." But governments just don't do this alone. Altif, you mentioned about big powers. They don't do it alone. They also do it with corporations, with ego-tripping rich politicians, the military, and I would like to add educational institutions. These institutions tend to socialize students into seeing violence resolve conflict. And this is what we do when it comes to war. We grow up. When students graduate in the United States, they often sing the Star Spangled Banner, which was written by a slaveholder, Francis Scott Key. We scream proudly. You'd think we'd be ashamed of this. The rockets red glare and the bombs burst in air. Don't they know that bombs burn children's legs and crush their heads? Let the blood of our enemies flow in the fields. I'm sorry to end with such a sorrowful images. But yes, the United Nations has its problems, but I still think it is our best hope for a socially just world constructed from the pillars of human rights. It's kind of hope that was found at the bottom of the box, opened up by Pandora, that let out all the evils of the world. But let me repeat, at the bottom of the box was hope. And our best hope, I think, is the United Nations. Thank you. Hope I didn't go over. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph Runka, for your very enlightened contribution. No doubt, United Nations remains the last hope for us to achieve the rights, dignity, and self-determination for the peoples. But as you already said, that we must add some teeth to those regimes which we have established in the form of UN special procedures and other conventions so that they could matter at long and we could bring states to the terms in that case. Otherwise, these conventions and covenants and establishment of the special rapporteurs, there's no meaning when the states don't act on it. They act selectively on these things. My next speaker will be my best friend, Robert Tatiana from Canada. Robert, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Hello. I'm honored to have been invited to participate on this important webinar today. As Professor Ronka said, criticism must be viewed as a tribute. My remarks today focus on some current failures of the United Nations, but I'm pleased that Professor Ronka also listed some of its many successes. I'm also pleased that he commented on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a vitally important. According to its website, the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, DPPA, says, quote, that the DPPA plays a central role in United Nations efforts to prevent and resolve deadly conflict around the world. DPPA focuses primarily on 5 areas in international peace and security. They're the following: ensuring sound analysis and early warning, preventing conflict and engaging in peacemaking, managing political crises and violent conflicts, sustaining peace, and enhancing partnerships, close quote. These are all just, even noble purposes, and in a more ideal world would be fulfilled. But in looking at current conditions in just a couple of areas of the world, we see that these goals are not being met, and in some cases not even being addressed. And the cost of this major violations of human rights and international law, both of which the United Nations is charged with protecting. We will first look at the current situation in Palestine. Israel, already in violation of dozens of UN Security Council resolutions, is now decimating the Gaza Strip, having killed more than 31,000 men, women, and children in the last 6 months, wounding hundreds of thousands more, causing nearly 2 million people to be homeless, and destroying more than half of the enclave's infrastructure. There was no early warning as required by the DPPA's own mandate. The right of Palestinians to resist their brutal occupation in international law has long been ignored by the United Nations. The victims of Israel's brutal genocidal onslaught, completely financed by the United States, had no early sound analysis of their suffering under cruel and illegal occupation. Nothing has been done to satisfy the second requirement, preventing peacemaking. Due to the outmoded and completely unfair veto power held by several Security Council member nations, Israel has continued carpet bombing Gaza and to use weapon of war. Political and economic considerations, it seems, trump international law and human rights every time. The DPPA is mandated to manage political crises and violent conflicts. Weaponing in Gaza satisfies the glories, but this is not something that started with the October 7th resistance. Palestine has been occupied for 7 decades of law, and the Gaza Strip has been blockaded by air, land, for 20 years. Periodically bombed the Strip even prior to its current genocide. The United Nations failed in managing a decades-long political crisis or doing anything to prevent violence against the Palestinian people, issues that the United States caused in its 1947 partition plan. Coupled with managing political crises and conflicts is sustaining peace. There can be no peace under occupation. The occupied people will always, despite the horrific brutality under which they suffer, resist. Assuring that Israel abides by international law would have brought a sustainable peace to the Middle East, but the United Nations has not focused sufficiently on the suffering of the Palestinian people. And what the United Nations must be made with other countries to sanction Israel for its constant, shocking violations, but their UN has not fulfilled its duty. While much of the world's attention is focused on the Gaza Strip, it must be remembered that since October, Israel has killed over 400 people in the West Bank and expanded illegal settlements there. A strongly worded objection from the United Nations. Let us turn our attention now to Kashmir. 7 decades of brutal repression have not been addressed in any meaningful way by the United Nations. There is no excuse for 70 years of neglect, years which have deprived the people of Kashmir of the plebiscite, guaranteed them that would enable them to determine their own future, years which have seen people arrested and incarcerated for long periods of time without charge. There can be no reasonable explanation for the deprivation of the basic human rights of freedom of speech and expression, freedom of movement and assembly, freedom of residence, association, and property, to name only a few. Yet these freedoms have been denied the people of Kashmir for decades, and conditions have only worsened since India's abrogation of Article 370 of its constitution on August 5th of 2019. The medical deprivation, sexual violence, and destruction of property that India has used against the Kashmiri group for decades has only increased since then. Where are United Nations peacebuilding efforts in these situations? Why are the people of Palestine and Kashmir not protected from such great harm? Why are their basic human rights being allowed to be violated in such extreme manners on an hourly basis? And what of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, and other oppressed peoples around the globe? They are human mandated in Geneva, Islamabad, Toronto, and New York, although not everyone in those locations experiences those rights. But in many places, entire populations are deprived of them. The United Nations, through the Department of Politics and Peacebuilding Affairs, and other of its departments, is the world's best hope to ensure the human rights of people everywhere, as Professor Ronka has mentioned. And as I've mentioned, it has not and is not living up to its potential. Genuine peace building will end hunger, oppression, fear, poverty, and a wide range of social ills. We must, United Nations as an organization, must work to end the unfair and unjust veto power in this. Doing so will greatly assist in fulfilling its vitally important mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for your contributions. As always, you are on spot about the situations around the globe, what's happening here. Now, I'll bring in my next speaker, Mr. Zafar Qureshi, who is from Jammu and Kashmir. And Mr. Zafar, you have the floor to tell us something about the Kashmir situation and what the United Nations has done to people of Kashmir and the Kashmir issue.
Thank you, Anisab. First of all, coming and attending this timely event. I think the topic's really great today, and we've got a really good list of speakers who are well expert in the various United Nations initiatives for the prevention of human rights, as well as obviously dissemination and making sure creating an awareness of UN. As Wani Saab said, I was born in Indian occupied Kashmir in a district called Baramulla. Alhamdulillah, I've spent my childhood, my relatives, uncles all come from there, being witness to the first-hand atrocities of the Indian army or the Indian missionary. There is a huge list of things that can be talked about, or atrocities that can be talked about. And I don't think we've got enough time. So today I really want to focus on two key conflict zones, namely the Palestine as well as Kashmir. The reason I've kind of looked into these, one, obviously Kashmir, it is where I come from, and Palestine, because these are the two regions which not only haven't had the not happening there, but they're the two conflicted regions which are recognized by the United Nations. Two regions which have had the longest sufferings in the whole world. And they were at the beginning of the United Nations who recognized that they are the disputed areas, they are illegally occupied, and they need to be, we need to bring peace and restore. So in Palestine, the plight of Palestine since 1948 hasn't been given an attention that it deserves. The policy of apartheid that has been continued for decades, even after the mass exodus of Palestinians in 1948, which is known as Nakba, quite commonly here, in 1948 has been whitewashed under the empathy of survivors of Holocaust. Palestinians have had no role in how the Jews were treated in Europe post the Second World War. October 7th, the incident which is now highlighted across the whole world, is not all of a sudden, but a result of a continuous human rights violation, illegal occupation, and most importantly, the topic that we hear, it's a failure of the United Nations to prevent these atrocities in the first place since 1948. And the plight of these Palestinians has been documented over the decades leading to the human rights. Similarly, as I said, in the area of disputed Jammu and occupied Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, The genocidal program started back in 1948 in November, where over 300,000 Muslims were massacred in Jammu. And this is not me saying that. You can check on the internet, you can look at the census that was taken at that time, and you can see how the population before the genocide of November 1940, what the Muslim population was and what it was reduced to after those genocides. For the very basic thing that the United Nations was formed to prevent such genocides, it was the first thing that they failed to do within their. Since this illegal occupation of 1948, since 48, as well as combined with the Islamophobic attitude of the Indian state machinery, which I'm sure you all have kind of seen the recent Modi regime of India, and that's just not the Muslims, but also the Dalits, the Sikhs, the Christians are being treated. This is something that create, and this is something that is directly in contradiction to the basic human rights, which is the right to believe. The people of Jammu and Kashmir, especially the Muslims of Jammu and Kashmir, have been specifically targeted. Over 300,000 massacred in 1948, and over 500,000 were displaced into the other regions such as Pakistan. Again, another failure of the United Nations to prevent any demographical changes in there. Now, the list as I can continue, we can talk about the over 150,000 further deaths that the Indian Army, the people that the Indian Army killed since 1990s, or the 8,000 enforced disappearances, not to mention rape against as a Kashmir. We've all heard of Kunan Pashpora, the two villages where the Indian Army came overnight, cordoned, dragged the women and the young girls from the houses and gang raped them. Those people, those women, those girls who have now grown up still wait for their justice. They look to the United Nations. Again, once again, the United Nations has let them down. It has failed to protect those basic rights that it has guaranteed them under the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. These atrocities were committed by the human rights activists as well as the international human rights organizations, and in this very prestigious institution, 2 reports have been released within the last 5 years, which documents. Now, this kind of brings, what can I say, a failure of the nations. The human rights defenders, the activists, the journalists, and the resistance leaders around the world, and not just in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir or Palestine or Syria, but across the globe, form the core blocks of this institution. They are the ones who document, who evidence, who disseminate the human rights violation that help institutions like the United Nations to prevent the human rights violations taking place. Now, these unsung heroes risk their lives to monitor, identify, who risk their lives, are the ones who've been let down. Unfortunately, the human rights activists such as Khurram Parvez, Irfan Mehraj, Asif Sultan, Masrat Alam, and there are many others, have been let down by this. Now, these are the activists or the journalists who spoke out the truth about Kashmir in Palestine and other places. They have now been imprisoned by the Indian machinery and are not allowed to. There's no civil society movement. Again, is it not the responsibility of the United Nations to protect these people? The very people that bring out the information in the conflicted zones. As I said, it's not just in Kashmir. We also look at other places, like, for example, Dr. Gokora Konda Naga, who was a principal in the New Delhi University. Again, he was arrested by the Indian government. For 10 years, he was tortured. Why? Because he stood up for the rights of the Dalit, a minority in India. Or Shireen Lehigh, a journalist who reported on the atrocities committed by Israel in Palestine. She was shot by the Israeli forces and killed. What did the United Nations do to protect them? What has the United Nations doing now to protect these defenders, the voices of the justice, the people who stand and report on those? Ladies and gentlemen, the last point that I want to make, I know when we have time as well, and still the hammer is going to come down. The key is, as Joseph Wonka said earlier, it is good to document. It's good to have the framework on the human rights issues across the globe. But what's more important is that we need proactive steps. Statements, reports from the institution like this are not enough. We need the United Nations to make sure there is an accountability against of these people who commit the atrocities on the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zafar Qureshi. As you rightly pointed out, that human rights defenders reprisals from the states, and fortunately, the United Nations has the human rights defenders. Myself, as a victim of that reprisal, when I approached the reprisals, they said that you should keep yourself safe only here. We can't guarantee you the protection in the homeland, but you should keep yourself safe here. They could harm you here also. And they can harm your family too. So that is the case while we see that no teeth in the human rights mechanisms. My next speaker is our very old friend, Mr. Leon Siu. Leon Siu, you have the floor defending the rights of the people of Hawaii and for their self-determination. Nothing.
Aloha i mai o kou ai manuhia ho'i i ke akua e ko ka ko makua e ka haku mesu me ka uhane hemolele. I greet you with aloha from Hawaii and really honored to be here. Mahalo thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. This UN peacekeeping and peace building. Of course, this was the primary purpose of the UN, was to create a peaceful means to settle disputes and a peaceful way to decolonize the world and to bring about a much more harmonious world through peaceful means. And of course, there have been many statements here made today very accurately saying that the UN has pretty much failed in purpose, even though that is their main purpose. I want to speak a little bit more about the second item they were to pursue, besides settling all conflicts through peaceful means. The other was to decolonize the world through peaceful means. At the time of the founding of the United Nations, there were 51 countries that founded the United Nations. And the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, around 75% of the world, was under some kind of colonial rule by about a dozen, mostly European countries. And so the United Nations very nobly said, well, this needs to end, that people have the right to self-determination. And so they set up a system or a process called the decolonization process, in which they basically said we would help to usher in a peaceful means for nations to become from the domination of other nations, mostly colonial nations. And this started to proceed, and it actually started to work fairly well from the beginning. And boundaries were submitted by colonial powers that put about 100 countries onto the list of territories to be decolonized. It's called the list of non-self-governing territories. And they proceeded to decolonize and became independent. Many of them joined the United Nations. After some time, about 40-something years, roughly out of the first 100 countries, or the 100 countries that are listed as territories to be decolonized, around 80 of them actually became decolonized. And some of them through having to take up arms and emphasize their need to be independent. So the United Nations gained about 80 countries from the decolonization list. And then there were other countries that were added and most of them were through the dissolution of other larger countries. The most recent ones was the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Now, the Decolonization Committee succeeded and worked pretty hard up until about 35 years ago. when they seriously slowed down the process. And this was probably caused by the fact that the powerful nations of the UN were saying, well, decolonization is over. Let's just keep it at the way that it is right now. So the last two countries that were admitted into the United Nations that were not the result of dissolution of larger countries, the last two countries were East Timor and South Sudan. Now, ironically, the way that they were able to decolonize was to go pick up arms. Whereas, of course, as you know, in both those places and in other places, bloody wars are ensuing. Instead of the peaceful means of colonization, the UN has actually moved itself into a position of the only way that a country can become decolonized today is to pick up arms and to be so devastated by warfare that the UN finally steps in and does something. And this is really a crime because the original intent was for decolonization through peaceful means. So the UN itself got itself into the position of basically decolonization can proceed is through warfare. So it's ironic. I want to bring this up because this is, of course, the exact opposite of what was meant in 1945 and 1940s was formed. Now, there are two countries that were list states on that list of non-self-governing territories in 1946, and that was Alaska and Hawaii. There are several other countries. Alaska and Hawaii, however, the United States decided that they would actually decolonize us, but through a very sneaky means. They didn't tell us that we were through the process of decolonization, and instead, one for Alaska and one for Hawaii, in which they had only one choice for our future governance. And so Alaska and Hawaii, they reported to the United States, reported to the United Nations, and actually gone through the chosen to become integrated into the United States. Nations, instead of actually investigating or actually verifying the validity of the United States, and they basically said the issue of the future governance, the future status of political status of Hawaii and Alaska has been settled. Hawaii and Alaska are part of the United States. The United States hijacked the United Nations goodwill of self-determination and decolonization and forced Alaska and Hawaii to become part of the United States, a mistake that was made. And so we are here and we have been campaigning for this to be revisited, that Hawaii and Alaska indeed did not give our consent to become part of the United States. The other part has been the United States treatment of our people and our lands, the stealing of our lands through the United States application of laws, taking our properties, and there's right now a major case going on in which a woman is about being auctioned off taking of her lands. So they've actually condemned her lands or actually ordered her lands to be auctioned without any cause and through a number of fraudulent acts brought on by the loan company as well as the court system of the United States. In a serious situation in which they're actually complicit in violence and creating takings and things like that. because of their inaction or because of their uh, inaction, but basically looking the other way and saying that everything's fine. Let's just operate on the basis that the major countries are doing okay and they can do no harm, and therefore we'll just let things slide. So this is my report. Mahalo.
Thank you, Leoncio, for your contributions. I think we have one more speaker. If Misbah Abbasi has joined us, are you there?
Yeah, yes, sir,
Misbah?
yes.
Yes. Please move on. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. I am Misbah Basi and sister of Bisharat Basi Shaheed, and I am from Azad Kashmir. And right now I am doing PhD from China. So first of all, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to introduce myself and also discuss the topic of human rights and United Nations. The Security Council today failed to adopt a resolution that would have demand or immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. And human rights are rights to all human beings, regardless of race, nationality, language, color, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the rights of life, include the freedom of opinion. But unfortunately, in the context of land, in the context of religion, over the last few months and years, we are witness in the real time what has happening in Palestine and Kashmir. And I feel to state on behalf of the people of Indian occupied Kashmir that we stand in complete solidarity with the Palestinian people. Because who better understand their difficulties than us? So my question is, where is the champions? Who stand with Palestine and Kashmir? Who has the courage of enforce the Security Council resolution? And I ask everyone, do you hear and see us? Thank you so much for everyone.
Thank you, Misbah, for your short intervention and short speech to the people. As was discussed about the land confiscation and many other things in different parts of the world by the occupants. Most recently, we have seen in Jammu and Kashmir after the application of Article 317/35A, a new settler project is uh, there, and the government of India is now taking away the land of the indigenous people in order to make them landless, jobless. This is always the project of an colonizer or an occupier. So the house is open now for questions, answer. If anybody has a question and comment, one from here, one from here. Two ladies have already raised. Questions are.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. A small introduction.
Your
Small,
mic to your.
okay. I translate my speech from French. I am Ghalia Jibi from Western Sahara, one of 17 countries non-self-determination, non-autonomy. Since 1991, Western Sahara has been waiting for the application of its right of self-determination provided by the UN 8 months after the ceasefire between the Front Polisario and Morocco. And it was the year of my release as a survivor of enforced disappearance. I am complaining to benefit with my people of our fundamental rights. Unfortunately, Morocco refuses with all discrimination to give the Sahrawi people who don't support the occupation a space to act as an active society and democratic. My question is how can we force the member states of the convention to respect their commitments so that the occupied people can choose their political future with full freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And you have just answered 2 minutes for you, then we have 1 minute more.
Yeah, I'm Nisha Davis. I'm from Association Culturelle Tamil of France, and thank you for this opportunity also. The panelists, you have well explained the situation of many people who are fighting for self-determination, and it's quite interesting to see that how much it speaks also for the Tamils in Sri Lanka who are still facing genocide in Sri Lanka. But the problem is it is forgotten by everyone here. So it is. I just remind you one number, which is not only a number, but is a plight of many people. Is 146,679 who are unaccounted from October 2008 until May 2009. And for these people who have been in those decade, as my colleague Professor Sana said, the justice can be made only through self-determination, and I really, I strongly support what you said when you speak about the third committee, I think third and fourth committee in General Assembly. So we need to file also the request for self-determination to be on the list of the list of the countries who are not recognized as how do you say, autochthon, as you say. But my question is, how can we, because you were speaking about war, about taking arms, and this is the way that the system is encouraging people to take arms. But as you well know, it is not possible, and no one is ready to do that. I mean, it is. How can we do that, avoiding war?
This is $1 million question. I would have gone to the experts, but unfortunately we have just 1 minute. I will conclude in 1 minute. You are the lucky NF, and you are also the lucky NF. You are on the list of non-self-governing territories list, and you also had a commission of inquiry for Sri Lanka. We are the unfortunate people who have given our more than 500,000 lives from 1947 till date, and to UN reports and all that. No action from the UN, no action from any of the world, no condemnation from any of the member states to the India, the violator, because they have their own business interests as well as strategical interests with this. World is divided this time. This is not the time of human rights. This is time of economy and interest. So that's why the civil society is getting very less and less space in this building also. So the only thing is that the civil society around the globe will have to raise again, and we will have to see another Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela to lead the civil societies and the people around the globe for their march.